Hello and welcome to Autology, the weekly podcast that brings you the latest on automotive technology. This week's episode is called What Do American Millennials Want in a Car? And you're here with me, Anna Büttner, and Brian Rhodes, Associate Director for Connected Car and Vehicle Experience, alongside Janina Mills, Automotive Consumer Research Lead. Hello to you both, and thank you for joining this week's episode of Autology.
Thanks, Anna. Happy to be here.
Same. Thank you.
So let's jump right in. This week's podcast is all about the consumer, more specifically the American millennial. So the first question that I really have is, what makes millennials as a consumer segment special or unique? Janina, maybe you can kick us off.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's a really good question. I mean, an easy answer would be just the sheer size of it, right? This group is generally associated with people born between 1981 and 1996, maybe give or take a couple of years here and there, but it's the largest generational group in the US, having recently surpassed the boomer generation. Granted, Gen Z, the group that comes after millennials, are the largest from a global perspective, but in the US, they still only take second place. So we're talking about just over, I think, 72 million people, making up almost 22% of the US population. That's a lot of buying power. But aside from just their numbers, millennials are considered to be the most influential generation, as well as being the first of the digital natives. So being the tech-savvy generation that they are, millennials typically do a lot of research before making purchasing decisions, right? Especially large ones like a vehicle or a home purchase. So they're not really impulse shoppers by nature. And these are the same consumers that are scouring the reviews on Amazon or forums and consult Yelp for a new restaurant before going. And I can certainly relate here. I'm one of those people that's reading those consumer reports and countless Amazon reviews just to find the perfect pots and pans for my kitchen. But an interesting point here is that despite the potential buying power of this group is also making less money than their parents did at the same ages. So price and value are very important. So to maybe make up for their financial deficits, whether the result of lower incomes, mounting debts, this group focuses on building up some reserves or savings, and they're making large purchasing decisions later in life. So again, spending wisely is a top priority here. This group also has some strong concerns geared towards health and environmental issues, and some of that obviously comes out in their buying behavior. These consumers don't want to just get more bang for their buck. I mean, obviously everybody wants that, but they want to make sure that the brands or the retailers that they're shopping with are also aligning with and reflecting their own values. And this not only speaks to their subtle activism, but also in how they portray themselves, right? So individuality is kind of a big deal with this group, and with everything being posted to social media, this is one of the ways that millennials continue to build their own personal brand. So I guess in a nutshell, millennials are the largest, most influential, and highly connected consumer segment to date with the substantial buying power. Just as a side note, I guess it's kind of funny if we just look back a few years ago when there was this big panic thinking that millennials were going to be the downfall of the automotive industry, right? That purchasing a car was no longer a priority or the rite of passage that it has been for previous generations, and that the industry was obviously going to suffer as a result of this. So we're seeing that there are more options, of course, other than your traditional buying or leasing a vehicle compared to previous generations, especially with the introduction of things like ride sharing, companies like Uber and Lyft, or car subscription models like Zipcar. But there's still that desire to have a vehicle. So the original concern, around millennials being the downfall of the industry just isn't the case. But it is apparent that the industry is changing, and in part thanks to this segment.
Okay, very good. So not a downfall after all. What is it then specifically? What are these millennials looking for in the US specifically when they're purchasing a car?
Yeah, I can take this one. From our survey data, almost across the board, every technology we survey about scored more desirable amongst the millennial population. So trying to kind of dig out what the key result of that is, there's a few that really stand out and I think are worth discussing. One that stands out is is voice recognition, and in particular, virtual personal assistants. So having Alexa embedded into your vehicle, or Google Assistant or Siri embedded into your vehicle. There's a big jump in generation with millennial and younger versus older than millennial here, looking at X and above. It's significant here, the attraction to, I think, using it outside of the vehicle, in smart home, and using it through your phone, and now bringing that same experience into the car, not only through just a plug-in method of using Android Auto or Apple CarPlay, but having an embedded experience where that speech recognition system that you're familiar with can really take over a lot of the operation of the vehicle. That rates as very attractive, comparatively speaking. In general, digitalization is very popular as well. So more displays, larger displays, more touch screen, less hard key and button. Not to necessarily an extreme. If you look at new vehicle interiors today, it's not necessarily that everything goes away and we just have a big pillar-to-pillar screen, but certainly moving more in that direction. And I think that vehicles today, in particular, when you start to go down in, even to entry-level vehicles, you're starting to, or you're definitely seeing that, right, on dealership lots. This is nothing particularly new, but there's so much more of a comfort level in that digital environment. Other things like smartphone as a key, which, I personally feel like this is one of the up and coming in terms of advertising. You see this brought up a lot in commercials and ads for new vehicles, whether it's supporting something from your Audi app to access your vehicle, or your Tesla app, or it's something like Apple Car Key that is kind of maybe agnostic to the automaker or the vehicle that you buy, but can be used across a number of them that deploy the technology. This is another thing that interests this buying segment quite a bit. So there's of course the interest in the traditional ADAS features, safety content, but broadly speaking, these few technologies really do stand out of particularly appealing.
Yeah, and to kind of build off of that, if we look at things like connected services, right, the connectivity features, we find that American millennials most often want safety and security as well as navigation in their vehicles. So we're looking at features like SOS emergency call and stolen vehicle tracking, real-time traffic, online navigation are what they want and what they're actually willing to pay for. But keep in mind that some of these are already available on their phones, and who wants to pay extra for something that they already have, right? But what's interesting is that our survey showed that less than half of the respondents indicated they preferred the user experience on their smartphone as opposed to their vehicle systems, which suggests that maybe the rivalry between the car and the smartphone comes mainly from those additional costs. So another interesting aspect of the connected services is the idea of data privacy. Everything is so much more interconnected, and our personal data is obviously a part of that. And so looking at millennials, there's a greater trust in tech companies for data use and privacy compared to automotive manufacturers. And as a slight contrast, we see that American Gen Z is actually a little bit more distrustful of both. And I guess on a slightly different note, another survey that we field is on the topic of ADAS systems and autonomous driving. And we're seeing that there's a little bit of a different preference when it comes to the features desired versus features that they're willing to pay for in this area. The top 5 most desired features, which would be things like blind spot detection, rear automatic braking, night vision, these features were correspondent to the most common risks while driving, which means that more of the population can intuitively understand the benefit that they would provide. So in contrast to the desirability for these features, those that were most desirable in the survey, which again are also widely available in many of the surveyed markets, were also the ones that consumers were least willing to pay extra for. So basically, millennial consumers come to expect a lot of these features to be built into the base price of the vehicle.
Yeah, Yana, I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
You bring up a really good point in terms of the smartphone aspect of this. So I think it is really important to distinguish interest levels from willingness to pay, because they're both important to understand, but there's a deep divide amongst the two of them, right? So functionality, we see a lot of this more often, functionality that's quite repetitive from the smartphone. Maybe it's more better oriented to the automotive environment, but in reality, it's probably just a little clunkier than how it would exist in a completely consumer electronics world. So I think this is important because when you talk about connected services, there's, it's not just about selling a service for $15 a month. It's also about potentially offering a good suite of either free services or an extended trial that maybe you could put some features that are interesting, but maybe not worth the spend. And the benefit from an automaker standpoint can be keeping sticky with your clients, right? Keeping them engaged into that infotainment system, engaged with when you want to offer hey, you should service your vehicle. Let me route you to my shop. This stuff is really important. It's a little bit harder to kind of understand the direct revenue impact of that, but it certainly has long-term ramifications that are interesting at play. And then of course leveraging where we move over to, okay, there is a willingness to pay here, right? So we should equip this hardware so that in the future we could sell these services, for instance, or these ADAS features because it works for this buying segment.
Yeah, makes sense. And so certainly an area where OEMs need to pay attention to what consumers want and what they're willing to pay for and what to maybe offer as part of a package from the get-go to get people hooked. But so you touched on connected services and also ADAS features, but what about powertrain? Forecasts show, of course, significant uptick in EV adoption in the next 8 years or so. But this is certainly met with some skepticism from many sides. Where does this consumer segment stand in terms of this growth trend, you think?
Yeah, I don't think it's too extreme to say this is, the millennial generation is the most important for this energy transition that we're going through right now. In our study, they're certainly the most populous group of current EV owners. Gen Z is definitely closer behind, but so far it's a smaller population. Gen X is definitely lagging, at least in the US. So you see this clear split on age of willingness to accept certain technologies. And we dig into some of the distinction there and why that might be. I think, one in particular, if you start talking about purchasing an EV, one of the first conversations you're going to have is on range requirements, right? What's the range of this vehicle? What's the comparable for an ICE engine, internal combustion engine, and then where's that balance somewhere in the middle. So when we look at Gen Y, they're willing to consider a vehicle between 100 and 200 miles of range. Gen X, 250 to 300. Millennials are right there in the middle. So you kind of see this, Gen X more pushing for parity towards what they're currently used to in terms of internal combustion. Gen Y willing to jump all the way down to a fairly low range vehicle, willing to kind of take that leap, and millennials right there in the middle. And that's where the market sort of is right now, or at least some of the new launches are sitting in that range. So it's a willingness to I wouldn't say come at this market early, because early in the EV market was probably 5 years ago, right? Maybe even earlier than that. But right now, there's a really sweet spot for where these vehicles are coming out, where they're priced, and what the ranges are to start seeing this uptick. The other aspect of this is that price point. There is a clear willingness to pay more than any other generation surveyed for hybrid and for fully electric vehicles by millennials. So that's important in itself, especially if the sticker price, comparatively speaking, is higher on an EV to competitive internal combustion engine vehicle. The last aspect that's really key here, I think, to understand is charging infrastructure. So one of the questions we ask is just on awareness. So understanding near your work or in general on your route, if or where those charging stations are. Millennials have a 15% higher awareness and a much higher acceptance of the current state of infrastructure. We talk about current state of infrastructure, right? We're not talking about all these new plans to add, 1 billion new chargers from here to there. It's where it exists right now. So, this is I think that, in reality, there is quite a bit of work that needs to be done on the infrastructure, but we have a buying segment here that's kind of willing to start now and invest in this space. So, I think the product that's coming out and will be coming out, even more soon, is really fitting well with the millennial generation, where how they're viewing electric vehicles.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. So definitely the range, that's of course a topic that keeps coming up in this context, and the charging locations. But what seems to be other drivers then for these consumers as it relates to a big ticket purchase, which of course a vehicle definitely still is? Are they looking for that next fancy feature, or what are the deciding factors here?
Yeah, I think, Jan and I have spent the most time talking about different technologies, and I think it's interesting because it shows deep divides generationally. So it makes sense to point that out. But the top three amongst any generation we ask about, it always comes down to safety, fuel, and pricing. Some order of that, right? Not necessarily in that order, but some order of those three. It remains the same. So when we talk about, if we want to pull out millennials specifically, we kind of compare the order. The top three are fuel, safety, and pricing in that order for millennials, right? That's fuel on top. When you look at Gen X, for instance, it's pricing, fuel, and safety. So yeah, it might not sound like a lot, but it's still the bread and butter for how you're going to sell a vehicle. And, particular when we start talking about electric vehicles and how you're going to, show comparable fuel economy and maybe some of the safety benefits and safety ratings that they're able to achieve. Conversely, the pricing, it might be more expensive, right? But if you look at that split of fuel on top and pricing, number three for a millennial, it does sort of open the door there, I think, for an electrified future.
Yeah, and as Brian mentioned, I mean, some of these, or the orders of some of these are based on more recent data, right? So 2022, 2021 is all well and good, but then if we're comparing it to some of our research in 2019, which is pre-pandemic, we find that still not a whole lot has changed for millennials, except for maybe technology was more important than pricing, and Gen Z maybe saw fuel economy as more important. But taking into account the importance of some of these conditions or these considerations during the pandemic, we have seen them shift. Our data show that millennials seem to experience the greatest impact on their driving habits as a result of COVID. We're seeing consumers driving less or just generally spending less time in their vehicles as a result of the pandemic, with a lot of them indicating that they're only using their vehicles for errands, right? Like grocery trips or medical visits. So it's not surprising that considerations like fuel economy, which have historically been a primary concern, are now taking a little bit of a back seat to overall pricing as well. Now, whether or not this will continue to be the primary consideration in sort of a post-COVID age is another question entirely. But for now, this is where we're seeing some of these habits and considerations change.
So certainly, yeah, a lot of factors that go into this decision. But let me ask you this then: has this changed how the consumer goes about buying their next vehicle? Ultimately, what does the vehicle buyer journey look like now then?
So to an extent, it has changed a bit for the overall vehicle buyer journey. Millennials, they expect digital, seamless, and convenient solutions, and Gen Z for that matter. When we're looking at the older generations, they're focused largely on maybe recommendations or word of mouth, or even just stopping by a dealership, seeing what's available for guidance. Millennials and Gen Z are doing their own research online. We ran a survey in 2020 at the beginning of the pandemic just to see how it was impacting the purchasing process for car buyers. And we found that more consumers were able to conduct their new vehicle purchase via online methods, making it, a heck of a lot easier and more convenient. So whether it was, finding the vehicle, scheduling a test drive, securing financing, negotiating the cost, or even just arranging for the vehicle delivery, online methods were consistently more preferred.
Yeah, and this is a kind of tale as old as time, right? We've been studying this question as an industry for as long as we started selling competitive vehicles. But it is, I think we do have to bring COVID up in this context, because it's changed everything. Whatever trajectory we were on of trying to understand how the next generation of buyers are going to prefer to buy a vehicle was turned on its head, and the whole industry went digital with the buying experience because you had no choice to, right? And I think that this just sort of lends its hand into pushing dealers along at a much faster pace than otherwise would have happened in terms of digital showrooms and having all that information online and being able to set up a maybe less painful, less pressure induced test drives and things like that, more kind of on demand. I don't think this goes away once, we all decide that we're going back to normal again, if there ever is that point. I think this continues from here on out. So yeah, the buyer journey I think looks different for everybody, but it's certainly lends itself to all of those points that Jana just pulled out from our survey data, in terms of what it looks like if you try to buy a vehicle right now, excluding the fact that you might not be able to find that vehicle in terms of just the process of finding the vehicle.
Right, very good. Yeah, thank you for your views on this. And then just before we wrap up today's episode, it would be interesting to know, how are these trends we're seeing in millennial buyers setting the stage for the younger generation of Gen Z buyers?
So I guess I'll just summarize that, millennials have in a way helped pave the way, right? For Gen Z. In many ways, they are very similar, like I mentioned. Both groups might be considered more frugal, more thoughtful or purposeful with their spending. They're also both very concerned with activism and being mindful of the companies that they shop with and maybe how they're perceived as well. But where it starts to diverge a bit is in the loyalty aspects. Gen Z may be considered a little bit more fickle here in that sense, and they need to be approached in a different way, especially since the experience of purchasing a vehicle in general is often seen as boring or even painful. I mean, obviously not physically painful, but just tiresome and unpleasant. So Gen Z needs to be approached a little bit differently, both in the way of capturing their interest, but also in keeping it.
I would argue it could also be physically painful. Yeah, I think loyalty is an interesting one here. I personally think that, through, shifting the generation of where who the folks that are currently buying most of the vehicles or will be soon, we redefine loyalty entirely. Considering how you stay sticky with a customer might not necessarily be just selling them a vehicle that's going to be dependable for 100,000 miles, right? And bringing them into service shops, but using connected services and some of this technology we've talked about to remain front of mind. For instance, the ability now to add a feature after you've sold the vehicle that wasn't there before is a big deal when it comes to loyalty, or at least I think it will be in the future. So if you're driving a car for 2 years and then it has Alexa added, and you're a part of this generation we've talked about that is interested in that kind of technology, at no cost, there's a pretty good amount of wiggle room for what a consumer is going to accept, right? They'll press yes. We've seen time and time again in terms of whatever data needs to be handed over, and if there's some growing pains when the technology is first launched, when it's the perception is it's quote unquote free, you've already purchased the vehicle and not adding an upfront charge. That's significant. Building in predictive maintenance, these types of things, stolen vehicle tracking that are increasingly today a part of a base or even a long-term trial or a free package is significant because it's a clear value add. It keeps you tied into this ecosystem from that brand and could keep you back to their, coming back to their service centers. If something as simple as being able to know that the vehicle has an oil change coming up, offering a $5 off coupon if they come to your service center is a big deal when there's however many other service centers you can get your oil changed on, on your route to work. I really think that this is key going forward, is making sure that technology is there in the vehicle to allow for more touch points that the customer views as a net positive to their experience in the vehicle. I think that's going to be a key aspect of loyalty, and loyalty ultimately, I mean, that's key in this industry, right? It's making sure that when they're ready for their next vehicle, it's not the consideration of any brand and any model and any any option out there. It's keeping them coming back to your showroom to pick their next car.
Very good. So yeah, loyalty can certainly look different from one generation to the next, or what that really means to that given generation. Great, thank you. And unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. A big thank you to you both for joining Atology.
Thanks, Anna.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
And thank you to all you listeners for tuning in as well. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's episode at our atology@ihsmarket.com email. And you can find out much more at autotechinsight.ihsmarket.com. Don't forget to hit also subscribe, follow, and like buttons to stay on track with the latest Atology podcasts. And we look forward to you joining us again in the next episode. Bye for now.